The Lost Van Gogh is a crime suspense thriller novel set in the art world. The story centers around the rumor that there's a lost self-portrait of Van Gogh, which he painted shortly before his death. And in this novel, the question is, has the portrait been found? And to what lengths will people go to possess it? Hi, I'm Dan Scunner, and this is Some Books Considered. And today, I'll talk with Jonathan Santlofer about The Last Van Gogh. I requested and was provided with a copy of the book, but this video is not sponsored. Jonathan Santlofer's previous novels include The Last Mona Lisa, The Death Artist, and Colorblind, among others. In addition to being a best-selling author, Jonathan Santlofer is a well-known artist. His artwork has been exhibited in galleries worldwide. And he joins us to talk about his latest novel, The Lost Van Gogh. Jonathan, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, you've written a number of novels that are centered around the art world. So what inspired this latest one?
Well, I did go to art school and I pursued an art career very seriously. And then my life kind of shifted and changed. But the last two books were really inspired by true events. The book before this, The Last Mona Lisa, was basically triggered by, the theft of the Mona Lisa in 1911, which I had known about but hadn't really researched. And then that became the backstory for that novel. This novel was really kind of two things, but the main thing that got it going was a letter that was written by Van Gogh's young artist friend, Emile Bernard, who was at his funeral and wrote a letter to another friend of theirs, which detailed the whole funeral, the procession to the cemetery, and the way Van Gogh had been laid out in the auberge where he lived in Auvers-sur-Oise, France. And they had put up on the walls supposedly most of the paintings he had made while he lived there. And in the letter, he talks about two self-portraits, but there's only one that we know of. So it got me thinking, well, did he make a mistake? Was he referring to the same painting twice? Or did something happen to that painting? And that got me onto this idea of a painting that had disappeared and what could have happened to it. And I traced that painting from 1944, the end of World War II, to the contemporary story. But then it goes back even further to what happened. I don't want to give anything away, but what happened to it after Van Gogh painted it,
And in this book, you're also continuing the characters from the Mona Lisa book. Tell us a bit about those characters.
So there's Luc Perron, his girlfriend, Alexis Verde. I don't just want to refer to her as his girlfriend because she's a very accomplished art historian, very complicated, smart woman. And then there's Interpol agent or ex-Interpol agent, John Washington Smith, who, and these three characters all met in the first book. And now I'm sort of, as I was finishing that book, the idea for this book kind of came to me as I was finishing that book. And I realized I wasn't finished with these characters and that they were still inside my head and they had a lot more to say. So I wrote the two books to stand alone, even though they use the same characters. I mean, I know people who've read The Lost Van Gogh first and now are going back to read The Last Mona Lisa. So you learn more about where they were then and what happened. Luc is an artist, kind of a bad boy who found himself ultimately through his art. And Luc and Alex share a really odd history, which is that Luc's great-grandfather is Vincenzo Perugia, the man who stole the Mona Lisa. And Alex's father is a big-time art criminal, an art thief. So they have this weird kind of connection in terms of this illegal criminal art background. So it was just something for me to kind of play with their backgrounds, and then of course John Washington Smith is an art analyst who studies art theft and art forgery at Interpol. And so their worlds kind of come together and collide.
So, in the plot of this book, as you point out, we learn about what happened to this Lost Van Gogh. And you tell the story, actually, as you pointed out, on different timelines and going back and forth between those timelines. I guess a two-part question here. What kind of challenge does that create for you as an author, and why did you make that choice? What do you like about writing with different timelines?
It's a great question. I'll try and answer it. One is I love novels that have two stories, particularly when there's a story in the past and a story in the present. This book and The Last Mona Lisa have that same structure, a story in the past that has to do with what's happening in the present. The story in the past, in both cases, is a smaller story that is time-wise. Those are smaller chapters that weave throughout the contemporary story. What I think is that the two stories have to inform each other. That as the reader's reading along, there were just natural points in my mind in the story where you wanted to find out something about the origin of this painting, of this object that was moving. And so I would go back and investigate that. It is a little difficult in terms of writing. And yet I've gotten very used to it. It's just something that feels very natural to me. And the people ask me all the time, well, how do you know when to break and go back to the past? It's funny because the story just sort of, it hits me as, oh yeah, this is a moment when the reader needs to know something about what happened. And I go back to that. Now, I should say, of course, there's tons of rewriting and rethinking and making sure it really works kind of seamlessly from one to another. But eventually in this book, like the other, this story that's happening in the past catches up with the story in the present. They meet, and we discover all of the things that happened and why those things happened and how they impact on what is going on right now in the present. So.
Now, obviously, you were able to bring your knowledge of the art world into play in writing this and your other novels, but I'm sure it also involved a lot of research. So tell us a little bit about the research that you've done. And I'm also curious about whether you found things that surprised you that you didn't know you were going to discover in the process.
Oh, yeah. My research, well, it's twofold because it's reading a lot and it's traveling. So the biggest surprises always come when I travel. In The Last Mona Lisa, I'm going back and forth because these books are kind of companion pieces, if that's okay. In The Last Mona Lisa, a friend of mine put me together with somebody he knew in Florence, an artist, and that artist got me into the prison where the man who stole the Mona Lisa was imprisoned for, after he was caught. And I didn't even know that prison still existed. But I got them to actually lock me in a cell, which was a little scary, but very interesting. And I used that scene in the book. In this book, I traveled to Amsterdam and to Paris. I was traveling to all the places where Van Gogh had lived in his life, and to the town where he died, Auvers-sur-Oise. But the most interesting surprise, I think, was again through another friend who put me together with a friend in Amsterdam, a Dutch woman. And this Dutch woman turned out to be someone whose grandfather had at one point owned Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet. There were two versions, but a very famous painting. And she has the painting was stolen by the Nazis in the war. And she has been fighting for 20 years to get that painting back, or recognition of her grandfather's ownership, which is exactly what I was researching for my book. These paintings that had been stolen during the war and what happened to them. And it was as if fate handed me this amazing connection, and so I met this woman, and then we talked about that. We actually had dinner at her house in Amsterdam, and we met again the next day because it was so, we liked each other and we hit it off, but also the connection to my book was so strong. So these kind of things, sometimes, you have to wonder sometimes I think Vincent, I say Vincent's looking over my shoulder, giving me these odd twists of fate. But that was really an amazing kind of coincidence. I also, of course, I read, there's a 900-page biography of Van Gogh, kind of great book, rather daunting. You pick it up, it's like, after you pick it up, you need to be in traction. But I read it in parts, and I read the whole book, but it offers a lot of we know a lot about Van Gogh from the letters he wrote. He wrote over 2,000 letters to his brother, to other artists, to his sister. But there are a lot of gaps because he had blackouts. He was in an asylum for a while. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding his death. It's not really as clear as people think. So that's a kind of another story that weaves through the novel. And I found out, I went to, as I said, the town where he died. I got to stand in his room where he lived, which was incredible. I visited his grave where he's buried next to his brother. All of these things, they add to a kind of a reality and a feeling about what you're writing. A kind of really connects you to the people and to the world that you're writing about.
Yeah, in addition to the fiction, which is a mixture, as you point out in the book, of fact and fiction,
Right.
you have additional material at the end of the book. And one of them is to address that notion of, you say, basically, this book is a mixture of fact and fiction, and here are the facts, and you lay that out. So tell us a little bit about that information that people will find at the end of the book.
I did that. I'm gonna tell people, don't do that. Don't look at the end of the book first. Of course, they can do whatever they want, but at the end of the book, it's true exactly what you say. That I have a page where I say, look, it's a mix of fact and fiction, but here's what really happened. Here's the things in the book that are true. I did that in the Last Mona Lisa as well. I sort of feel like if you're writing a historical novel that's a historical fiction, I felt at a certain point that there was an obligation I had to let the reader know what was true. And by letting them know what was true, it implies that what I made up. So in the Mona Lisa book, I embellished the story of the thief from the past. And in this book, there's a lot of, I created, for example, somebody who John Washington Smith, the Interpol guy, is put together with, who is what we might call a Nazi art looter hunter. And there are such people, and in my research, I talked to Interpol people, I talked to FBI people, I even talked to someone from Scotland Yard. So I gather as much information as I can that's fact. But I will say that in the end, while I'm writing, the story becomes more important to me, So what's fictional, what works has to work for the story becomes my end goal. But I do think it's kind of nice to let your reader know what's the true information and what isn't true, and that's why I did it. I just think, particularly in a world where we live in, where so many things are not true or up for grabs as to whether they're true or not. I wanted the truth to be stated, at least as I knew it.
Another thing that you share with readers are sketches that you made
Yeah.
while you were doing your research. Tell us a bit about those.
Sure. As I said, I went to art school. I studied art very seriously. I still do that. I still paint and draw, but I do it very differently now. I was pursuing that very seriously in my life, and then I had a fire that destroyed 10 years of my work at a gallery, and it sent me into this other world. And I'll tell you, I don't recommend a fire, but it changed my life in a very interesting way. I was on a course, and it's given me a second career that's been really interesting. So, because of that, because of my art background, I tend to see things visually, and I think I write very visually. I try to see a scene in my head as I write it. When I go someplace for research, like when I'm in Amsterdam or in France, I have a sketchbook and I draw things as I go along. I ask the people I meet if I can do sketches of them. In Amsterdam, I drew the canals. Uh, I went through the Van Gogh Museum and I did drawings of Van Gogh's self-portraits. And the reason I do this is because I'm trained visually. It's a way for me to connect on another level. And so I come home and I have sketchbooks filled with images and drawings. And my editor knew this. And so she looked at them and she said, oh, she thought it would be fun and great to add just a couple of my sketches or a few of my sketches to the book, ones that related to things in the novel. So I think there are 8 sketches at the end of the book that relate to places I was and that where my characters were. So, for example, there's a scene at the Anne Frank house, and when I go to do research, I try and ahead of time set things up. So a curator at the Anne Frank house brought me through parts of the Anne Frank house that the tour group doesn't see, which was incredibly moving. And so I got to be there alone with him, and I just did a drawing of the residents, the people who had been in hiding. It is a picture on the wall, and I drew from that. And then I went through with the tour group because that's how my characters would do it. But that's just one example, and that's in the book. My editor thought it would be fun. I was standing in front of the Van Gogh Museum, and there's this big metal reflective sculpture, and I was taking pictures of myself in it. And then I started doing a drawing. It's very meta, right? A drawing of myself taking the pictures in front of the Van Gogh Museum. So I actually finished. I didn't even finish the sketch, but I did more on the sketch when I got home. But that's at the end of the book. And my editor thought it would be sort of both fun and interesting to end on a self-portrait that I had made while I was traveling for research. So that's in the book,
Jonathan, there's a question that I like to ask authors of fiction, and it's this. If you could spend a day in real life with one of the characters from your novel, who would it be and why?
Wow. That's a very complicated question. I'll tell you why. But I will answer it. It depends on which character I'm writing. And that's the character I am most interested in at that moment. I feel very close to Luke, but when I'm writing Alex, I feel close to her. Of this book, I was about to say I'd want to spend my day with John Washington Smith, the Interpol analyst. But then it struck me that probably the character I'd want to spend time with is the woman who heads up the task force in Amsterdam, who is searching for this art dealer who deals with Nazi looted art. I have a feeling she would be the most fascinating character. She scares me a little, she's so tough and fierce. And she's a character I created based on my research of these real people. But I'd like to spend time with her to find out, because I'm very, I'm really interested in and sort of bowled over by these characters who are so brave, who are willing to risk their lives for something they believe in. In a way, I mean, I think John Washington Smith is a character like that as well. So I guess it depends on the day you asked me that question, but I kind of answered it.
Jonathan, I know through the course of this historical fiction, the story will reveal whether or not the characters believe or find out whether there really was this Lost Van Gogh or whether it is just a myth at this point. But after all the research that you did, what's your take on it?
Well, that's, again, a very interesting question. I would, as you write a novel like this, you become so invested in your story, your theories, your characters. So I would love to think that this painting exists, that it really exists. It probably doesn't. It probably doesn't, because my feeling is it would have been found by now. On the other hand, they discover things all the time. I don't know, it was probably 6 months ago, they found a bookmark that Van Gogh used that he made little sketches on, little drawings. And this had been, nobody was even looking for it. So we do find these things. I think this particular painting, it's unlikely, because if it did exist, I think it would have been found or it's been destroyed. And that when the Nazis were collecting art and stealing art, they also destroyed a lot of art. There were bonfires where they destroyed art. They stopped doing that because they realized that a lot of the art they didn't like, the degenerate art, as they called it, was worth something. And so they sold it to support the war effort. But before that, they were destroying a lot of art. So this painting, if it exists, I think it probably no longer exists if it did exist, which is too bad. I mean, I, of course, like so many people, would like to be like Alex in the book, who goes to a an antique store and buys this $25 painting, which she brings home. I mean, we all have that fantasy, of bringing home the painting we spent no money on, and it turns out to be this amazing, extraordinary thing. I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen. It does happen, but, not sure about that.
The novel is The Lost Van Gogh by Jonathan Santlofer. Jonathan, thank you for talking with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Your questions are great. I don't often get such pointed, well thought out questions, so I appreciate that.
If you'd like to purchase The Lost Van Gogh, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner, and thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.